Hello and welcome to the Chalke Valley History Show on Sunday the 28th of June. Well, this would have been the last day of this year's History Festival, and of course it's the last of our 7 shows that we're having instead, but we've got a pretty good lineup. We've got Tom Holland, my big brother, talking about his book Dominion, A History of Christianity. We've got Clare Mulley, we've got Living History, and we've got one last trip down memory lane.
I am Ricard de Sinclair, and I do reenactment for the immense salary and the photographs. Well, the photographs.
He's just going to shoot his propeller off. Garros isn't stupid. He instructs his fitters to put large metal plates on the inside of the propeller blade.
My name is Joanna Grochowicz and I'm a polar historian and author. My narrative non-fiction focuses on the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. I first went to the Chalke Valley History Festival in 2018 to talk about Captain Scott and my book Into the White about Captain Scott's Terra Nova expedition, and I totally fell in love with the festival. I thought it was fantastic fun. A week of really fascinating speakers talking about a really wide range of historical topics. Absolutely brilliant, set in the most gorgeous area of Wiltshire. It was such a privilege to be invited back to talk about Roald Amundsen and my latest book, Amundsen's Way, all about the Norwegian polar expedition in 1912. I had spent a month in Antarctica at the beginning of the year in February, and when I got back to New Zealand at the beginning of March, I received the very disappointing news that the festival had been cancelled due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So unfortunately, I'm stuck in New Zealand, unable to go to the UK and share that story. But I thought what was really interesting was reflecting on my time away, the isolation of being in the Ross Sea and being totally without any kind of communications, and then coming back to civilization only to find a similar situation with, being shut down and isolated, not being able to travel anywhere, not being able to see family and friends. And it really, I couldn't help but draw parallels with the latest work, my latest book, which I was finishing off while I was in Antarctica. And that's all about Shackleton's Imperial Transantarctic Expedition of 1914. The story is quite well known, how Shackleton and 27 men went south to the Weddell Sea aboard the Endurance. They were caught in the sea ice. The boat was beset and ultimately was crushed by the sea ice. They didn't manage to step foot on the continent, but what they had to endure was a far greater challenge than anything that they had planned for, because once the boat was crushed, they then had to spend several months living on an ice floe, totally isolated, a time of huge anxiety. They were not going to be rescued. They needed to establish some sort of order, some sort of routine, and they needed to wait. They needed to wait until something happened. It was quite interesting for me to draw parallels between what I'd been writing about and what we were all experiencing, people all over the world, not just in New Zealand, but in Europe and the UK, Australia, Asia, everywhere. Everybody was plunged into the same bleak existence. A lot of waiting, a lot of anxiety, a time of great danger too for a lot of people. And it made me really consider what the Shackleton's men, the 27 men that were stranded on the pack ice, what their strategies were for coping with uncertainty and for this extended period, open-ended period of waiting. And that was certainly one thing that Shackleton was adamant about, never actually letting people give up hope. He always gave them something to focus on. And certainly his attitude was such that the men couldn't despair as long as he was in charge. I really hope that we manage to get the pandemic under control and that we see a return to some form of normal life next year. I really hope that the Chalke Valley History Festival goes ahead in 2021 because it is a brilliant experience for authors and historians and for audiences as well. And I would really love to come back and perhaps talk about my new book, Shackleton's Endurance.
We're sitting here by a Spitfire, but actually it really ought to be a Messerschmitt, shouldn't it?
Yes, it could be. I mean, obviously there were female pilots in the ATA, but the two women I wrote about were something different. They were test pilots, and they were the only two female test pilots in Nazi Germany. Extraordinary, because it was a very macho regime. They thought women should be Kirche, Kucke, Kinder. So if that's not extraordinary enough, the other thing is that they were complete opposites. So one of them, Hannah Reich, the better known one, blonde, blue-eyed, sort of very Aryan, and very keen to lend her name and face to the regime, very keen supporter of Hitler.
Yeah, I mean, she was a massive celebrity in her day, wasn't she? I mean, everyone knew who she was.
Collectible Gabati cigarette cards, Hitler Famous Beauty series.
Wow.
And yes, she was in films, on the front cover of magazines. If you see Hitler's birthday, she's there in the footage, weeping with emotion.
Yeah, early helicopter pilot.
First woman to fly a helicopter, first person to fly a helicopter inside a building in 1938 in the Deutschlandhalle.
Yeah, I love that story.
Close enough to the seats to blow the gentleman's hats off, apparently. Whereas Melita is the complete opposite. She is, well, in around 1935, she discovers that her father had been born Jewish. And, this is when it becomes relevant to her family for the first time, when Nazi racial prejudice is enshrined in law with the Nuremberg laws.
Yeah.
And suddenly she has a very different perspective. And she already did. She was already critical, but this is solidified. And she realises that she needs to do something really special to protect herself and her family. And she becomes this brilliant, not only test pilot, but aeronautical engineer. And she develops the dive brakes and the dive sights for the Stuka dive bombers.
Oh, it's just extraordinary story, isn't it?
And then that's not enough for her. She feels she's made a pact with the devil. And, well, by the end of the war, they end their lives on opposite sides of history, very different routes through the war.
So where do you go for your research for that? I mean, is that off to Freiburg or where is it?
Yes, there and in Munich for the National Archives, but that's where Hannah's family deposited her papers. But the more interesting things, I think those ones have been filtered, is private archives. So Nazi memorabilia collectors have got various papers Hannah wrote in the 1970s that she is very candid in, never thought they'd be put anywhere, that really exposes her horrendous anti-Semitism and shows us that she shared that Nazi worldview. There is no question of it. But the most fantastic thing I found was about Melita von Stauffenberg, who has kind of been forgotten and written out of the history books. And I followed a little trail and interviewed her nephew, who is the son of Klaus von Stauffenberg.
Amazing. He
brought me over, had a wonderful silver service breakfast with him at his Schloss. And among the other things, we have Melita's handwritten 1943-1944 diary. And one of the pictures I give in the book is 20th of July 1944. We have this handwritten account that no one's really looked at before.
Amazing. And I know as a historian, when you get those moments, you find those bits of paper, that absolute primary archival resource. It's just happy days, isn't it? I mean, they're golden moments for the historian.
It is, absolutely. I mean, this is a document, it tells us so many things. It's a private diary, it's semi-coded, so that's very interesting. Then it tells us about the war Germany more broadly, the little things she's commenting on, the little stories behind it. But it also tells us about the way we look at history, because this is a brilliant piece of primary evidence that has been overlooked. The bomb plot has probably one of the most written about episodes of the Second World War, and this is completely disregarded because it comes from a female who nobody thought would be involved, and the diary shows she was right in the middle of things.
Fantastic. And listen, why do you think it is that both of them achieved so much as women? How were they able to do that in Nazi Germany?
Well, a couple of things. Firstly, they were both absolutely brilliant pilots, and Melita was, second to none as an aeronautical engineer. But even the Nazis felt this is odd. I mean, obviously they don't particularly want to promote women. Partly it's done for PR reasons, but they become valuable for the war effort as well. And in Melita's case, they can't really understand how a woman, what she specialises in is these dive bombers, the Stukas. So they're going at nearly 80 degrees, nearly vertical. And quite often pilots would lose consciousness. They'd red out, they'd black out, and they'd crash and die. And Melita, if one male pilot did a test and then they tinkered around with it, that's courageous already. Then if he comes back and retests it that same day, that's heroic. Melita would do 15 tests in a day.
That's amazing.
She did over
isn't it?
2,000 during the course of what? Nobody comes near her.
Nerves of steel.
Absolutely
I mean, just imagine
extraordinary.
you're in a Stuka cockpit and you are diving down at 80 degrees and the world is hurtling up towards you. We always see the Stuka, don't we?
So much you can't really read the control panel. The
Yeah.
sound of it is extraordinary.
Yeah.
So, but the Nazis thought it must be because she's a woman. Maybe women's blood, ratio of red to white blood cells is different. They're always looking for a biological explanation,
Yeah, of
right? So
course.
they're trying to work out some excuse that can make this viable. But of course, it's nothing to do with that. It's her determination and her skill.
Well, I have to say, it gives me particular pleasure to introduce this, our last of our 7 special talks this week, because it's my big brother, Tom, and he's talking about his book, Dominion, which is a wonderful, fantastically thought-provoking history of Christianity and its massive influence on the Western world.
The thesis of Dominion is pretty easy to spell out. The idea is that pretty much everyone in the West, whether you are a believer, non-believer, whoever, that your assumptions, the things that you take for granted, are fundamentally shaped by the inheritance of Christianity, perhaps in ways that you've never even thought about. That if you like, if we live in a goldfish bowl, then the waters that we swim in are basically Christian waters. And this was an idea that when I began the book I was pretty confident about, but there was one area perhaps that I was slightly less sure about than others, and that was the field of sex, of attitudes to men and women, because that is something that over the past few decades seems really to have changed. So part of the fun of writing the book was working out whether I got that right. And over the course of writing it, 2 things in particular happened that profoundly worked to shape my approach to that particular theme. The first thing that happened that influenced the course of the writing in Dominion on sex was a trip that I made in 2016 to Iraq, and specifically to an abandoned town called Sinjar, which had been captured in 2014 by the Islamic State, then recaptured by the Kurds. So when I visited it, it was still very much a frontline place. There were, Islamic State were just a mile or so away from the front line, so very much within missile distance, which meant that the town hadn't been repaired. Rubble was everywhere, corpses still lay scattered, and this made it kind of viscerally present in a way that nowhere else I'd ever been. Took me back to the way in which wars had been fought and cities stormed in antiquity, because what the Islamic State had done was peculiarly vicious. They targeted the inhabitants, a religious minority called the Yazidis, whom Islamic State fighters saw as devil worshippers, with a degree of cruelty that seemed to me harsh even by the standards of the Islamic State. They had slaughtered many of the men, crucified some of them, slaughtered many of the women, but enslaved many of them. And these were women who, in many cases, were even girls as young as 9. And those who were held to be attractive enough to be not just domestic slaves, but sex slaves, were taken off and sold, and the rest were slaughtered. And this, of course, had a huge impact on me, because I was actually standing in the place where many of the bones of the women lay scattered in the open fields. And it influenced me in a way that nothing that I'd ever seen, in no archaeological site, had ever had quite such an impact. But it did also make me wonder, why am I having this response to it? Why do I feel this so strongly? Because, of course, were I living in the Roman period, I would have regarded it as something that happened completely naturally. Taken it for granted. This was exactly how the Romans always behaved. If you resisted, you could expect your men to be slaughtered, your women to be enslaved. And I think that the reason why there is that chasm of difference between my feelings and the feelings that people would have had 2,000 years ago can be explained by a convulsive process of change that happened in the 1st century AD. So why the difference? Well, fundamentally it comes down to the very different ways that today and back in the Roman times that people understood how sexuality should be comprehended. For us, there is a kind of fundamental binary. Essentially, we think of sex in terms of male and female. For the Romans, that wasn't the case. They were interested in whether, say, a man was predominantly interested in sleeping with men or with women, but it wasn't fundamental. It was a kind of foible, a bit like we might talk about a man who's interested exclusively in blondes or brunettes. For the Romans, the real division was between those who had power and those who did not. And those who had power essentially were free Roman male citizens. And they had a license pretty much to do anything that they liked to people who did not have that qualification and who did not come under the protection of a free male citizen. So if you were a slave in the household of a free Roman citizen, you were absolutely open to being used by that citizen any way that he wanted. It didn't matter what gender you were, it didn't really matter what age you were. You were essentially there to be used pretty much as a urinal might be used, as a receptacle for excess fluid. And this was an assumption that pretty much everyone in the Roman world took for granted. And the fact that it is unfathomably different to the way that we understand it is due to the emergence in the 1st century AD of a revolutionary new way of understanding sexuality. The great revolutionary in the field of sexual ethics and behaviour, as in almost every other field, is Paul, the first Christian writer that we know of. And he articulates for his converts a radical new way of understanding how men and women should behave and how they should relate to each other. This is not all of it by any means original to Paul. He is a Jew, and so he brings with him profoundly Jewish assumptions. Jews do think that the great division between human beings is between male and female. That goes right the way back to Genesis, to the way that God is thought to have created male and female separately. But what Paul brings to the table is something new. It's an idea that God has come down in human form, has suffered death on a cross, has risen from the dead, and that he has done this out of love for every human being, and that this love of Christ for his people, for his church, is the great model that provides the template for how humans should behave. And that if there are to be sexual relations between men and women, then it has to be modelled on the relationship between Christ and his church. And Paul casts the male as Christ, and he casts the female as the church. And this, for Paul, provides a model with seismic implications. To us, perhaps, the idea that the man is Christ and that the woman is the church might seem a little patriarchal, but in the context of the 1st century, this could not be, in a sense, more radically feminist, because the implications are profound. Paul is writing to Roman householders in Corinth and, of course, in Rome itself, and he's telling these male householders they have to behave like Christ, and Christ does not go around raping the page boy or the scullery maid. Instead, he is saying you can only sleep with your wife. You can't sleep with anyone else. And he's saying to the women of the household that your bodies are your own. They are created by God. They are the image of the church. They have a kind of sacral purity. And therefore, you have the right to do with your bodies as you wish. and every male has to respect your body as such. So it's a call on women to preserve their bodies as though they are their own, a radical notion, and to men that they have to display sexual temperance. And both of these ideas are profoundly contrary to most things that Romans would have taken for granted. And yet, like a kind of acid burning its way through the assumptions of Roman society, these are teachings that become so effective that first of all, they help to persuade the Roman Empire itself to become Christian. And by the 6th century, they have almost completely obliterated all traces of the way that the Romans 600 years previously would have taken sexual behaviour for granted. So the implications of these teachings are not confined just to that I mentioned of the marriage bed or to the household. They end up radically reconfiguring the entire way that society in what turns out to be Latin Christendom, medieval Christendom in Western Europe, all the ways in which that ends up becoming something very distinctive. So clearly, once the church has established itself as the great power in medieval society, it's determined to continue reining in sexual appetites. And it does this with a series of dictates, a series of laws passed at various councils and meetings. And by the terms of these, it's declared that men are not allowed to marry women who are not their first cousins, not their second cousins, not cousins right the way up to 7 degrees of separation. And the reason that this has a seismic impact is because up until that point, as generally across most civilizations, marriages had been organised on the basis of clans. A clan leader would marry one cousin off to another cousin to keep things literally in the family. But the church prohibits that. And so over the course of the Middle Ages in Europe, the power of the clan is shattered. And in its place, a new model of the family emerges, a model that is centred around a man, a woman, and their children, what we would call today the nuclear family. And this, of course, is something that today we take completely for granted, but is entirely a result of the teachings of the medieval church that ultimately go back to Paul's teachings. So if clan lords aren't choosing who marries, then who is? Well, essentially it comes down to individual men and individual women deciding to marry one another. And so you have the seemingly paradoxical situation that the great midwife of the idea of romantic love is actually the church. And this is something that survives the Reformation, the collapse of the monopoly of Catholic power, and is perhaps most evident in a play written in a Protestant city, Romeo and Juliet, where you have Juliet is going to be married off to her cousin. She doesn't want to marry her cousin, she wants to marry Romeo. And who is it marries Romeo and Juliet? It's the friar. So at the same time as you have the development of this idea of romantic passion in Protestant England, you also have people upholding the traditional idea that the bodily integrity of a woman is a fundamental principle, and there's a clue to the people who upheld that most of all in the nickname that was given them of Puritans. The idea of bodily purity is incredibly important to them. And despite their reputation, Puritans were not against sex. They were simply against extramarital sex. They thought that sex within marriage was incredibly important. And this, of course, was something that the Pilgrim Fathers and others who followed them took to the New World. And these were ideas that then became fundamental to the great colony and then the independent state of America that grew up. And right the way up into living memory, these ideals remained fundamental to the way that people in both Britain and America understood the functioning of sexuality. But then in the 60s, something did change. The idea that love should not be understood primarily in the Christian sense, the sense that Martin Luther King, the previous decade in the 50s, had made the animating spirit of the civil rights movement. Instead, the idea came to bed down that love was about self-expression, free expression, and that any attempt to inhibit the expression of love was repressed, bigoted, uptight. And the idea of ancient Rome as a kind of sexual free-for-all in which Paul turns up wagging his finger and spoiling the party really bedded down. And so over the past few decades, absolutely, you have seen a kind of a repudiation of pretty fundamental Christian teachings about particularly the idea that the human body is something fashioned by God and therefore inherently sacred, that both men and women have to respect. So I was writing the book and I thought, oh well, okay, obviously the field of sexuality, that's something I'm just going to have to admit, the influence of Christianity has faded. And then the second thing happened while in the course of writing it that in a sense came to my rescue, and that was the Harvey Weinstein affair, with the Me Too movement that followed it, because the fascinating thing about that was that very few people turned around and said, okay, what's wrong with it? Because obviously a Roman would have taken completely for granted the right of someone like Harvey Weinstein to sexually molest his inferiors. It was just a given. The fact that by and large not just women but men as well felt that his behaviour was unacceptable and indeed criminal reflects just how profound the revolution affected by Christian ethics, Christian attitudes to sexuality remains. And perhaps nothing better exemplifies the kind of the paradoxes that flow from that than the way in which on the women's marches that immediately followed the inauguration of Donald Trump, the most colourful costumes worn by protesters were invariably the red robes and white bonnets worn by handmaids in the TV adaptation of Margaret Atwood's novel The Handmaid's Tale, which was set in a kind of parody of New England, a theocratic, oppressive state, modelled on the Puritans. And yet the paradox was that Me Too protesters were essentially demanding that men behave more like Puritans, that they respect the bodily integrity of women and that they display sexual continence. So in a sense, it was the perfect note on which to end the book, this kind of Moebius strip that constitutes the relationship of the contemporary West to the immense edifice of the Christian past.
Today we're going to cook a lamb pasty. Now this is a Tudor recipe. It's quite an opulent recipe. It uses lots of herbs and spices that were available to the slightly more wealthy. And the lamb itself was, up until very recently, grazing in this very field in which we're cooking. So it's got absolutely zero carbon footprint. And in the Tudor period, they obviously didn't have gas or electric. You cooked over open fires, and it was all wood burnt or charcoal. So I'm going to get some charcoal from the oven and put into our chafing range, and that will give us the heat to start the process going. So I'm going to dig all the way back into here, get some nice chunks of charcoal. And the oven is very hot already. I can barely keep my hand near it, which means it's probably around the 250, 280 degree range. Because most of the ingredients that we're going to be putting inside this are already cooked, we can actually get away with having a slightly hotter oven so we can get a nice crisp on the pastry itself. So I'll just put the bars there and we'll get a pan on the go. A couple of blasts of the bellows just to get the heat really roaring. Dice up your lamb, cut off any of the stringy bits of sinew that might still be left. And the spice, that's what makes it more Tudor in its flavour. You're talking about nutmeg, cloves, mace, and most importantly, cinnamon, salt and pepper. And then you want to mix in the spice with them, rub them in well. And just an onion, lightly diced. And finally, your herbs. Yeah, so we're just going to give those a rough chop. Get your pan getting quite hot, and you want to put your butter in there, just about an ounce of butter. Right, we're going to pop this into the pan with a bit of a sizzle, and we're going to brown this off.
That pan's really heated up now.
Yeah, it's just been sat on the coals. Then remove the lamb and add your onions, and fry your onions in the meat juices. Put the lamb back into the pan, and that's where you put a good slosh of red wine in. For the pastry, it's very, very simple. You want about a cup of plain flour, about an ounce of butter and an ounce of lard, and then you just want to put in a splash of water. Very nearly there. You don't want to overwork the flour. Roll your pastry out onto a well-floured board and cut it into a rectangle. And you want a rectangle to be roughly 4 inches high by about 8 to 9 inches long. Place the lamb onto one side of the pastry. Place your onions over the top. And then a good quantity of your chopped herbs on top of that. And then you want to put an egg wash around the perimeter of your pastry. I used a feather. Feel free to use a pastry brush like normal people. Fold your pastry over and then use your fingertips just to crimp it down all the way around all 4 sides. Get your egg wash again and brush that all over the pastry. Put that into an oven somewhere between 250 and 280 degrees, and it will take sort of 15 to 20 minutes. And there you have it. It's a really simple recipe. It'll only take you about 20 minutes to prepare, 20 minutes to bake, and it'll give you a real taste of the 16th century. And you can sit there and feel like a king at a table with the opulence of all these wonderful flavours and spices.
I'm here with Colin Bell and Bernard Gardner, who were both pilots during the Second World War. Chaps, what's it like to be at a history festival and actually be part of the history?
Oh, brilliant. Brilliant as far as I'm concerned. It all brings it all to life. It projects the image of the Royal Air Force, which I'm thoroughly support. It's a very happy occasion.
Yes, absolutely. I quite enjoyed it. It was the first time since the war that I've been involved in anything like this.
Well,
so
I'm even more honoured then that you're here.
Yes.
I should say, of course, Colin, you flew the Mosquito in the war. I mean, what did you make of that aircraft?
Well, it was a brilliant aircraft. It was capable of doing anything and everything, whether it was for photo reconnaissance, whether it was for night fighter, whether it was for night bomber, which was me, and you name it, it could do everything.
And it was fast, wasn't it?
And of course it reacted like I imagine a racing car would react. It was the very, very best aircraft you could wish to fly. It could outpace every propeller-driven aircraft that the Germans could send up against us, with the exception of jet aircraft. But of course it was subject to the lethal anti-aircraft fire, which the Germans could throw up, predicted anti-aircraft fire, as we knew to our cost. There was one famous occasion when I was coming back from Target, Berlin, what else?
Yep.
And I thought, well, I was safe and I was on my way home, so I started sleeping. And
That's extraordinary. Well, you just nod off at the controls.
I frequently slept once I'd trimmed up the aircraft to fly straight and level. And it was the job of the navigator to wake me up, because that's after all what navigators for. If I was straying off course, or when I needed to land back at base, it all worked perfectly. But what I hadn't allowed for was that although we were flying straight and level, we'd strayed across a training school for anti-aircraft people. And this was manned, in the main, by German women. And they were only allowed one shot a night.
Right.
And they watched us coming across with joy, I've no doubt. And at the right moment, they shot a shell up, and it landed literally on our starboard wing. And it caused us a great deal of alarm and confusion.
And you woke up?
Huh?
And you woke up?
And I woke up. No, what else? And but unfortunately, they didn't bring us down. They ought to have done. It was very good shooting. We continued on our way back to Downham Market, and that was the end of the story for that night.
But Bernard, you were flying Typhoons, and I've always loved those aircraft. I mean, they're sort of big brutes of a fighter aircraft. I mean, what was it like to fly it?
Well, initially it was quite daunting.
Was it?
But after a couple of hours flying, it got used to it, and it was a pleasure to fly.
Really?
Yes, it was. Yes.
And they were super quick, weren't they?
Oh yes, yes. Yes, over 400, which was quite a good speed. You can't
Very
keep
good
up
speed.
with a mosquito bite, but...
But also armed with rockets, cannons. I mean, they were armed to the teeth, weren't they?
Yes. Yes, the 8 rockets, when all fired together, were the equivalent of a broadside from a cruiser.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
How amazing.
Yeah.
And of course, you had to be a bit wary of flak, I guess, when you're.
Oh, absolutely.
Because you're operating quite low levels, aren't you?
Because we were in low levels, so it was not only the 88 mil, because they were quite good with that as well, but also the 20 millimeter cannon, which were they had massed together, and so it was that was quite something coming up at you.
I bet it was.
Yes.
Well, listen, it's a great privilege to have you both here. Thank you so much for coming.
That's right.
And you know, we're all in awe of what you did. We all live in such peaceful times these days. But thank you for coming.
We're all in awe of what we did.
Well, yeah,
absolutely.
Hurrah for that. Thank you.
Hello, Chalke Valley History Festival. It's wonderful to be with you in this virtual way. I'm sorry that I'm not with you again in person this year. I've so enjoyed my visits in the past. I've been asked to select a single object or item to talk about for a short while. And the item I'm going to talk about is a letter written on the 17th of December 1939 by a man called Otto Wächter to his wife Charlotte Wächter. I've come to know the Wächter's son, Horst. He lives in a dilapidated castle in an obscure village in the northern part of Austria. His father, Otto, was governor of Krakow and then of Galicia, and he is the subject, along with his wife, of my book, The Rat Line. Horst has the vast archive of his parents' writings, from the moment they met in 1929 to the moment Otto died in 1949. 20 years, 10,000 pages, many, many gigabytes. One letter in particular stood out for me as I thought about my conversations with Horst, who wants to find the good in his father. I, on the other hand, am more interested in the man who is indicted for mass murder. And the letter that interested me, it was one buried amongst thousands, was written whilst Otto was in Krakow. His wife was in Salzburg, or Zell am See, and he has just been appointed governor of Krakow. The letter is dated the 17th of December 1939. It goes as follows. My dear Humpschen, many thanks for your lovely letter. There's a lot going on here. On the one hand, we've had some lovely things in the last few days. Chirac, General Arbeitsführer Polenz, R.M. Funk, and the Philharmonic was a great success, and also a great success for me. Funk was very impressed. On the other hand, not such nice things. Sabotage, a nasty business, car accidents, and ultimately an attempt on the life of the Governor-General. Tomorrow, I have to have 50 Poles shot. Why did I choose this object? I chose it because I'm interested in words, in correspondence, in letters, and in diaries, of which there are a multitude in the paper of the Wächters. But this letter contained a clue. It contained a clue as to what Otto Wächter had got up to, and it became a fulcrum, a fundamental point of disagreement between Horst and I. Tomorrow I have to have 50 Poles shot, Otto writes to his wife Charlotte. What does it mean? It offered a clue. It took me 4 years to discover who the 50 Poles were and where they were shot. But more to the point, it offered a point of contention between Horst and I. I have to have 50 Poles shot. Horst told me, you see, Philippe, he doesn't say, I want to have 50 Poles shot. He didn't do it because he wanted to. He had to do it. And from that, Horst derives the interpretation that his father was a good man who was simply following orders. I followed the trail. I found the photo album, which described painfully what happened on the 18th of December 1939 in a small town called Bochnia. I put 3 of the photographs into the book. One shows a group of 25 young Polish men being lined up, fear etched in their eyes, snow on the ground. The second shows them at the moment of execution. And the third shows Otto Wächter supervising, powerful, in a long black leather coat. Why did I choose this object? Because letters and words tell us absolutely everything, but they are always open to interpretation.
Well, that's it. That's the Chalke Valley History Show over for 2020. Of course, we haven't had a history festival, but we will be back. Please do save the dates for 2021. It's going to be June the 21st to the 27th. And, well, I've missed it. I don't mind admitting, and I hope you have too. And I hope what you've seen this week reminds you of all the many things we do here at the Chalke Valley History Festival and gives you a taste of what's still to come. See you next year. Hello and welcome to the Chalke Valley History Show. Today we should have been welcoming you here to this wonderful part of southwest Wiltshire in the heart of the Chalke Valley to the Chalke Valley History Festival 2020. We haven't rolled over, we're still here and we're bringing you the next best thing. Each day this week we'll have a host of brilliant historians, living history.
When I pull the trigger,
when you do this, you can use your hands.
This is where we get the term daylight robbery from.
It's making the pigments and the paintbrushes.
New talks.
The thesis of Dominion is pretty easy to spell out.
So what Okinawa ultimately did is it concentrated minds.
And you just have that immediacy with the past.
If I could humanise Siberia a tiny bit, then I'd done my job as a journalist.
You won't find answers to who you are in your genes. You'll find them in your history.
What does that mean in the context of a class-based society?
We should all stand in that field doing real things with meaning behind them, with a purpose.
We'll be looking into the archives.
Jefferson sort of embodies the paradox, people say, of the American dilemma.
I'd like to say it'll all be over by Christmas.
We have this handwritten account that no one's really looked at before.
Amazing.
We're all in awe of what we did.
I do hope you'll enjoy it.